The Middle Ages often bring to mind images of knights in shining armor, grand castles, and elegant queens in flowing gowns, but life back then was far from romantic when it came to love, marriage, and intimacy. The Catholic Church held enormous power, and with that power came strict rules so bizarre that they might leave you shaking your head in disbelief. From calendars filled with forbidden days to the idea that pleasure itself was sinful, medieval people lived under a system of control that went far beyond faith. Today, we're diving into 5 of the creepiest and strangest beliefs about sexuality in the Middle Ages. And trust me, once you hear them, you'll be glad you live in the 21st century. Imagine planning a romantic evening with your partner, only to realize that the calendar, not your feelings, dictated whether it was allowed. In medieval Europe, intimacy between married couples was strictly limited by the church. Sundays were automatically off-limits, since they were considered holy and reserved for God. Thursdays and Fridays, forget it. Those were days of preparation for communion, meaning physical affection was forbidden. And if that wasn't enough, entire religious seasons like Lent, Advent, and Pentecost completely banned intimacy as well. When all these rules were added up, couples found themselves forbidden from being together for nearly half of the year. Imagine the frustration of newlyweds realizing that their marriage bed had to follow a religious timetable. Even more disturbing was the idea that breaking these rules wasn't just frowned upon, it was believed to risk your very soul. For many, a single mistake on the wrong day meant a ticket to eternal damnation. This one might sound completely insane to modern ears, but it shows just how twisted medieval logic could be when filtered through religious rules. Of course, bestiality was condemned by the church as a grave and unnatural sin, no surprise there. But what's shocking is how the severity of punishment changed, depending on whether the sinner was married or not. If a single man confessed to such an act, the official church penitentials, handbooks for priests to assign punishment, usually prescribed 40 days of fasting, prayer, and penance. Harsh, yes, but relatively light for what was considered such an abomination. Now, if that same sin was committed by a married man, the punishment was drastically different. 10 years of penance. That could mean a decade of fasting on certain days, restrictions on attending celebrations, isolation, and repeated confessions. The logic behind this strange double standard? According to the church, married men already had a lawful outlet for their desires, their wives. Therefore, they were considered more guilty because they had chosen corruption despite having a holy alternative. Single men, on the other hand, had no spouse to control their lust, so their sin was viewed with more leniency. In other words, marriage was seen not as a union of love, but as a tool of discipline, a way to control human desire. And this example reveals something bigger. Rules about sexuality in the Middle Ages weren't just about morality. They were about power, obedience, and control. Another bizarre restriction was the complete ban on intimacy with pregnant women. Today, many couples find pregnancy to be a time of deep closeness, but in the Middle Ages, it was treated as a spiritual and physical barrier. The reasoning was simple, but deeply flawed. The church taught that the only purpose of intimacy was procreation. If a woman was already pregnant, the act was therefore considered sinful and unnecessary. But it didn't stop there. Religious leaders also spread frightening beliefs that intimacy during pregnancy could be dangerous. Some claimed it could cause miscarriages. Others believed it might lead to children being born with deformities or even possessed by evil. These were myths, of course, but in a world with little medical knowledge, fear and superstition often ruled people's lives. The result was that husbands were forbidden from being physically close to their wives during one of the most emotional and vulnerable times of marriage. Instead of providing comfort, affection, or intimacy, these rules forced couples into cold separation. Women were often left isolated, treated as if their bodies were untouchable during pregnancy. Looking back, it's tragic how these beliefs robbed couples of moments of love and support. Today, modern medicine has shown that intimacy during pregnancy is not only safe in most cases, but can even be beneficial for emotional bonding. But for people in the Middle Ages, fear and religious control replaced compassion and science. Today we often associate Catholic priests with celibacy, but what many don't realize is that this was not always the case. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, priests could marry, raise children, and live like ordinary men. But that all changed in the 12th century. At the First and Second Lateran Councils, 1123 and 1139, the Church officially banned priests from marrying. Suddenly, centuries of tradition were overturned. Why the change? Historians point to two main reasons. The first was spiritual discipline, the belief that priests needed to be completely dedicated to God, free from the distractions of family life. But the second reason was far more practical and political: land and wealth. If priests had wives and children, their estates and possessions could pass down to their families, weakening the Church's grip on property. By enforcing celibacy, the Church ensured that power, money, and loyalty remained under its direct control. This policy was reinforced again in 1215 and later at the Council of Trent in the 1500s. It became a cornerstone of Catholic life, reshaping the very identity of the priesthood. But for many priests, it also meant living a life of loneliness and denial, cut off from one of the most basic human experiences. Some historians even argue that this strict enforcement created more problems than it solved, leading to secret relationships, hidden children, and scandals within the clergy. Whatever the case, celibacy became one of the most defining and controversial rules of medieval Christianity. If there is one belief that really shows the strangeness of medieval attitudes, it's this: pleasure itself was considered sinful. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that intimacy was only justified if it created children. If a man sought intimacy with his wife purely for enjoyment, he was essentially treating her like a prostitute. This wasn't a fringe idea, it was mainstream church teaching. Even earlier, in the 4th century, St. Jerome went so far as to say that a man too passionately in love with his wife was no better than an adulterer. To them, passion was dangerous, lustful, and corrupting, even if it was directed toward your lawful spouse. This turned marriage into something cold and mechanical. Husbands and wives were expected to live without romance, without affection, without joy in the most intimate part of their lives. Love was seen as suspicious, and desire as a trap of the flesh. For modern people, it's hard to imagine a relationship where passion itself was condemned. But for medieval Christians, this was the reality, a worldview where even loving your spouse too much was treated as dangerous. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture castles, knights, and great battles, but the real story of medieval life was written in rules that reached into even the most private corners of people's lives. From bizarre punishments that treated married men more harshly than bachelors, to the ban on intimacy during pregnancy, to the belief that pleasure itself was a sin, the Church shaped society with teachings that sound unbelievable today. For many people, love and marriage weren't just about companionship. They were about obeying a system that saw desire as dangerous and passion as corrupting. It's a reminder of how powerful institutions can be when they claim authority over human lives. So what do you think? Which of these medieval rules shocked you the most? Was it the strict celibacy of priests, the strange punishments, or the idea that love itself could be sinful? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more hidden and creepy stories from history. Because sometimes the strangest tales aren't about knights or kings, but about what happened behind closed doors.